Tonight we pull back the velvet curtain on one of history's most calculated betrayals, a conspiracy where spiritual authority was weaponized for cold, hard gold. When the Knights Templar grew too wealthy and too powerful for the crowns of Europe, the cross they wore became a target. In a web of state-sponsored terror, forced confessions, and burning pyres, we witness a pope who traded the lives of his most loyal defenders to appease a king. It was the morning of Friday, October 13, 1307. Without warning, the bailies and seneschalks of the King of France stormed the properties of the Order of the Knights Templar. Within the space of a day they had arrested all the Templars in France, except for no more than a couple of dozen. Many of those who'd escaped arrest on the day were rounded up within a few short weeks. To the shock of the medieval world, the order stood accused of heresy. In ordering the arrests, the King of France had written that the Templars were guilty of a bitter thing, a lamentable thing, a thing which is horrible to contemplate, terrible to hear of, a detestable crime, an execrable evil, an abominable work, a detestable disgrace, a thing almost inhuman, indeed set apart from all humanity. Philip IV of France, September 14, 1307. These words marked the downfall of the order. Within a few years the order entirely disbanded, its properties confiscated and many of its members imprisoned or burnt at the stake as heretics. But what was it exactly that the order was guilty of? Were they even guilty of anything at all? The Order of the Poor Knights of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, or the Templars as history remembers them, began in 1119. The order was founded just 20 years after the First Crusade had taken Jerusalem from the Fatimid Caliphate. Their purpose was to protect Christian pilgrims visiting the Holy Land. Originally consisting of just 9 knights and lacking in financial resources, the order survived on charity. The Templars famously adopted the symbol of 2 knights riding a single horse to emphasize their poverty. They also adopted an iconic uniform, a white surcoat emblazoned with a red cross. From these relatively humble beginnings a great military order would grow. At the height of their powers the order owned land and properties throughout Europe and the Holy Land and numbered some 10,000 to 15,000 members. During the time of the Crusades, they became a formidable military force. They played a key role in the battles for Palestine, providing a corps of skilled knights to shore up the armies of the Crusader states. For 2 centuries, the Crusaders fought for control of the Holy Land. They named the kingdom they established their Outremer. At the height of its power Outremer would encompass much of Palestine, the Lebanese coast and parts of Syria and southeastern Turkey. However, by the end of the c. an increasingly united Islamic world was gradually driving back the European invaders. The end finally came in 1291 when Acre, the last Middle Eastern city held by the Crusaders, fell to the Mamelukes. The kingdom of Outremer was no more. The Templars were there to the last. Many died defending Acre but, in the end, their efforts were in vain. Despite the defeat at Acre, the Templars were still a formidable force. They owned significant lands across Europe, had accumulated substantial wealth and commanded significant numbers of men. Over the past 2 centuries the order had grown to include not only soldiers but also a whole range of brothers engaged in supporting activities. It even had its own clergy, charged with attending to the spiritual needs of the brethren. As the order's power and influence had grown, it had become increasingly involved in banking. Initially, the Templars had issued loans to Crusaders to help them equip themselves and pay for their passage to the Holy Land. However, as time went on, the order increasingly expanded its banking activities to offer loans more widely. Nevertheless, after 1291, the primary purpose for which the order existed, defending pilgrims in the Holy Land, was effectively defunct. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Templars, spent much of the 1290s traveling around Europe attempting to garner support for another crusade. He'd continued to deploy Templar resources in the eastern Mediterranean to raid and harass coastal cities like Acre and Alexandria. He even strengthened the island stronghold of Road, just off the Syrian coast. His plan was to use Road as a staging ground for an invasion to retake the old Syrian Templar citadel of Tortosa. But de Molay's efforts came to nothing. The Mamelukes wiped out the last Templar base on Royat in 1302, and he could persuade none of the kings of Europe to definitively commit any significant forces to another crusade. In late 1306 or early 1307, de Molay met with the Pope to discuss how to recover the Holy Land. His plan was grandiose and unrealistic. He conceived of an army of 15,000 knights, 50,000 foot soldiers, and a large supporting fleet. To raise such a force would clearly require significant support from the kings of Europe and the Italian city-states. At the time, there was no sign that any support on such a grand scale would be forthcoming. The Pope raised the possibility that the major military orders should perhaps merge so that they might better pool their resources. Although de Molay's response hid behind the veneer of apparent objectivity, it is clear he was hostile to the proposal. Innovation, argued de Molay, was always dangerous. The truth was that the Grand Master had no fresh ideas. Times had clearly changed, but the order was struggling to adapt. This was not the first time that anyone had proposed merging the orders, and it was an idea that had some support outside the papacy. One of its most vocal advocates was a Norman lawyer by the name of Pierre du Bois. In 1306 Du Bois wrote a tract entitled, Concerning the Recovery of the Holy Land. In it he argued strongly for the merging of the orders, since they have such a great quantity of rents, crops and possessions on this side of the Mediterranean Sea, which for a long time now have made insufficient contribution to the Holy Land. The future of the order, at this stage, could not have looked more uncertain. Prior to the arrests of 1307 the Templars had been subject to some vague suspicions that perhaps all was not well. New members joined the order in a reception ceremony at the Templar preceptories. These ceremonies usually occurred behind closed doors, and usually only with other members of the order present. During his reception a new brother would sign over all his property and worldly goods to the order and take vows of poverty, chastity, piety, and obedience. The structure of the Templars was similar to a monastic order, following many of the same rules as the Cistercian monks. So, becoming a Templar was a major commitment. However, the wealth and power of the order naturally bred jealousy in many quarters. And the secretive nature of their reception rites raised suspicions in the minds of some. However, there were no specific allegations of heresy against the Templars until around 2 years before the arrests. Initially, the accusations of heresy stemmed from a disgruntled Templar following his expulsion from the order. He made his accusations to the French king who, in turn discussed it with the Pope. The Pope in his turn discussed it with de Molay. At the time the Pope was highly skeptical of the accusations and the general feeling was that they were false. Nothing more than vindictive lies from a man who clearly had cause to hold a grudge against the Templars. However, by October 1307, the subsequent investigation resulted in the arrests. The articles of accusation finally appeared in August 1308. They contained a long and detailed list of charges. Some of the more colorful allegations included: item, that they made those whom they received spit on the cross. That they told the brothers whom they received that they could have carnal relations together. That in each province they had idols, namely heads, of which some had 3 faces, some had 1 and others had a human skull. Item, that they adored these idols or idol, and especially in their great chapters and assemblies. The precise nature of the idols the Templars were accused of venerating, and what they supposedly represented, were not spelt out in the official accusations. However, during the subsequent interrogation of the Templars, one confessed that he had seen an idol like a bearded head and claimed that it was the figure of the demon Baphomet. The demon Baphomet was first mentioned at the time of the First Crusade. Troubadours of the time used the name to denote Muhammad, and a crusader from the period claimed that the local population prayed to this demon. Baphomet seems to have been conflated with Muhammad on at least some occasions in the European mind. It may even be that the word Baphomet was simply an old French form of the name Muhammad. But was it true? Were the Templars really worshipping idols in the form of heads representing a demon? Initially the arrests occurred only in France at the instigation of the French king. Elsewhere in Europe other monarchs were more skeptical. The Pope was slow to confirm that he had even ordered the arrests. He had almost certainly authorized an investigation, but there remained some uncertainty over whether he'd ordered any detentions. Aside from France, the major centers of Templar activity in Europe were in England and Aragon. Elsewhere the order was more sparse. Edward II of England was skeptical and declared that he could not give easy credence to the accusations. However, in November 1307 the Pope finally issued the bull Pastorales Preeminentia, authorizing the arrests. Edward II acted in January, although he seems to have simply placed many of the English Templars under house arrest in their preceptories. James II of Aragon was similarly reluctant to believe the accusations at first. In the end, he too was persuaded to move against the Templars. Arrests followed in other European countries in a somewhat piecemeal manner. The speed of the arrests and rigor of the subsequent investigation also varied, depending on the ruler and the seriousness with which they took the charges. However, nowhere were the arrests made as swiftly or the investigation pursued as vigorously as it was in France. Over a period of time confessions were extracted in support of the accusations. Individual Templars confirmed they had spat on the cross, participated in homosexual acts, venerated idols, denied Christ, etc. The problem with all these confessions was that they were extracted under torture or under the threat of torture. Their veracity is therefore highly questionable to say the least. It is also the case that torture was only systematically employed in France. As a result, most of these incriminating confessions are French. Nowhere else obtained significant numbers of such confessions. Edward II of England and James II of Aragon were both far more reluctant to employ torture to extract confessions. As a result, initial interrogations in both countries yielded mass denials of any wrongdoing. It took a few years and the eventual application of torture to finally obtain a mere handful of confessions. One of the accusations revolved around the secrecy of the Templar initiation rites. Certainly, the rites often took place in secret and the order actively discouraged non-Templars from attending. However, initiation rites did not always happen in secret. In England, for example, one initiation ceremony had been performed in the presence of a crowd of 200 witnesses from outside the order. One senior English Templar explained that the rites were only usually held in secret to discourage foolishness. But, at the end of the day, secrecy alone proves nothing. The accusation of homosexuality probably had some truth in it. In an order of 10,000 to 15,000 supposedly celibate men, it would be surprising if none of them had ever broken their vows of chastity. There were almost certainly individual instances of homosexuality. However, it would be a great leap to take that as firm evidence of a ritualistic institutional practice. The only confessions detailing institutional ritualized homosexual practice were extracted under torture, or under the threat of torture. Virtually all such confessions originated in France, where torture was most universally applied. The only real evidence for heretical practice that seems to have come to light without the application of torture arose from some of the English interrogations. Here it appeared that some of the brethren misguidedly believed that the masters of the order were able to hear confessions and grant absolution. In fact, the masters of the order were not ordained priests and therefore not authorized to perform the confession. This was technically a heretical practice but more a product of genuinely mistaken belief than systematic and deliberate wrongdoing. As to the actual evidence for more serious heretical practice, denial of Christ, idol worship and demon worship, confessions of such acts were only obtainable by torture. Evidence based on confessions obtained under torture can't be relied upon. But, aside from the confessions, was there any other evidence? If the Templars had been practicing esoteric rites and worshipping idols, then surely we might expect that there would be some form of material evidence. Perhaps occult books or ritual paraphernalia of some kind. And, of course, if the Templars really were worshipping idols, where were all these idols? If these acts were indeed an institution-wide problem, then surely many such items must have existed, spread across Europe. But even in France, where the affair was pursued with the greatest vigor, surprisingly little material evidence was uncovered. Not one incriminating occult book or work of heretical writing was found. Neither were any of the head idols described in the confessions ever found, despite an extensive search. Guillaume Pittouay, the royal custodian of the Templar goods at Paris, searched for several weeks and was only able to find a single artifact that might count as a head idol. It was a large silver-gilt woman's head. Inside it contained fragments from a woman's skull wrapped in linen. It was said to be a relic, the remains of the skull of one of 11,000 virgins. It did not match the description of any of the heads described in the confessions. Nothing else was ever found or produced in any court. The bottom line is that, aside from highly dubious confessions obtained by torture, there is no evidence to show that the Templars were guilty of heresy. According to the French court, the arrests of October 1307 had been made by the officers of Philip IV acting at the Pope's request. On the surface of things this appears to be true. Philip had certainly discussed the matter with the Pope and had been asked to investigate the allegations. It is also true that Philip had made the arrests following a specific request made by Guillaume de Paris, the papal inquisitor in France. And it is also true that the Pope issued a papal bull in November, instructing the monarchs of Europe to arrest the Templars. However, a closer look reveals that Guillaume de Paris had close links to the French court and was, in many ways, Philip's man. It is also the case that the papal bull was issued after Philip acted and not before. In fact, Pope Clement V does not appear to have specifically authorized anything other than an investigation. Philip IV, it seems, colluded with Guillaume de Paris to jump the gun, and make the arrests. Presenting Clement with a fait accompli, Philip essentially badgered the Pope into endorsing his actions after the fact. The truth is that the real driving force behind the accusations, the arrests and the trial of the Templars was Philip IV of France. But why? Philip IV became King of France in 1285. He was the 11th of the Cape-Tian line and, because of his famed physical beauty, he was widely known as Philip the Fair. The personality of Philip the Fair is obscured to us by the fact that, throughout his reign, he mainly acted through his officials. A number of key officers came and went during his time, each serving as his primary policy maker and mouthpiece. They were the men who, in general, took the lead in announcing policies and organized whatever it was that needed organizing. All the while Philip himself remained largely in the background. This led some people at the time to characterize Philip as something of a non-entity, guilty of inaction whilst his corrupt officers manipulated him. In the 1290s the dominant courtier was Pierre Flot, the keeper of seals. After Flot's death in 1302 a new favorite emerged in the form of Guillaume de Nogaret. When Nogaret died in 1313, Enguerrand de Marigny, the royal chamberlain, stepped to the fore. One commentator of the time compared Philip to an owl. A bird that looks magnificent, but which doesn't actually do anything of any use. However, an analysis of Philip's policies reveals an underlying consistency that spans his reign. Documentary evidence also shows that Philip was indeed actively engaged, sometimes even directly managing events from behind the scenes. It seems all too clear that it was Philip himself who called the shots. It suited Philip's purpose to let the likes of Flot and Nogaret take most of the blame for unpopular policies. The reality was that the Flots and Nogarets were simply Philip's henchmen tasked with doing his dirty work, and there was plenty of dirty work to be done. During his reign Philip became embroiled with a number of costly disputes. In the early part of his reign a dispute with Edward I of England over Gascony was followed by ongoing conflict with the Flemish. The resulting wars quickly drained the royal coffers. Philip needed money. The taxes Philip levied were high and unpopular and inevitably led to dissent and unrest. There was only so far Philip could go with general taxation without risking riots and revolts. A second source of money was the church. And so, Philip's regime put a great deal of energy into taxing it. So much energy in fact that, according to one churchman of the time, Philip's sergeants, with a multitude of armed men, rushing up to the abbeys and houses of canons and other ecclesiastical persons, break into houses and doors, cellars, chests and barns, take what they can find with them, and sell it at a great market so that they can have the money immediately. Another scheme was to ask rich people to loan the king money. The only problem was that it wasn't really a request so much as a command backed up by threats. And the chances of getting any of that money back were pretty slim to say the least. Picking on a wealthy minority was another good way of raising money fast without upsetting too many people. In 1291 it was the turn of the Lombards. Two families of Lombard bankers and financiers were especially active in France. The king had borrowed significant sums of money from them, and, at the time, it looked likely he'd borrow more. However, instead he ordered the general arrest of several Lombards, accompanied by the seizure of their assets. The pretext being that the Lombards were apparently guilty of making usurious profits. This had the double bonus of generating hard cash fast and allowing Philip to cancel his debts. In 1295 it was the turn of the Jews. Jewish money lenders were the target. Usurious profiteering again provided the pretext for arrests and asset confiscation. Like the Jews and the Lombards, the Templars were a relatively small but wealthy minority. Now that the Holy Land was lost, their primary raison d'etre was gone. There were also plenty of people who were jealous of their power and others who were suspicious of their secrecy. By another happy coincidence, the king owed the Templars money, a lot of money. Then along came a disgruntled former member of the order with a grudge, making wild accusations of heresy. For a man like Philip the Fair, it was simply too good an opportunity to miss. After a few years of investigation, interrogation and torture, Philip finally had what he needed. There were enough damaging confessions to condemn the Templars. On May 12, 1310, Philip had 54 Templars burnt at the stake as heretics. On March 22, 1312, the Pope officially disbanded the Order of the Knights Templar. Jacques de Molay himself initially confessed to heresy. However, he withdrew his confession, claiming his only wrongdoing had been to give a false confession to begin with. He was declared a lapsed heretic and burnt at the stake on March 18, 1314. Outside France, however, the Templars were generally treated less harshly. Most were simply pensioned off and only a few remained in prison. With their order disbanded, most former Templars simply blended back into society. Some joined monastic orders, others quietly lived out their lives on their pensions. There was still a potential problem for Philip, however. The wealth of the Templars technically belonged to the Catholic Church. Thus once the order disbanded, it was down to the Pope to decide what should be done with their lands and properties. The decision was taken to hand it all over to the Hospitallers. Philip proceeded to comply with this decision, very slowly, and only after getting his outstanding Templar debts cancelled and, of course, deducting his expenses. His expenses were, or so he claimed, only those costs incurred by the arrests, the investigation and trials. After claiming an initial settlement sum of 200,000 livres tournois, he later discovered additional expenses that needed to be claimed, a further 60,000. After his death his son, Philip V, later remembered a further amount of expenses that had apparently been forgotten about, 50,000 this time. The apple, it seemed, had not fallen far from the tree. Elsewhere in Europe other monarchs proved similarly slow to hand over Templar lands to the Hospitallers. The fall of the Templars provided the monarchs of Europe with an opportunity to make some money out of the whole sorry affair. It was an opportunity few would allow to pass. Only once these expenses were fully paid up were the lands and properties finally handed over to the Hospitallers. At the end of it all, one Hospitaller ruefully commented that their order was poorer after inheriting the wealth of the Templars than it had been before. Amongst the confessions obtained by the French during the interrogation of the Templars, is the curious tale related by Jean de Chalons from June 1308. According to de Chalons, Gerard de Villiers, the master of France had been tipped off about the imminent arrests in 1307. He therefore escaped arrest and spirited away a large hoard of Templar treasure. According to de Chalons, Brother Hugues de Chalons fled with the whole treasure. Brother Hugues and the treasure had apparently set out to sea to destinations unknown in a fleet of 18 galleons. It was a preposterous story, and no other witness could be found to corroborate his claim. For one thing, there is no record of the Templars possessing a fleet of anything like this size in France. In La Rochelle, for example, they possessed just 2 cargo ships, unsuited to anything other than short voyages. It also seems highly unlikely that such a large fleet of ships could have slipped out of a French port unnoticed. Nevertheless, the confession has sparked a lot of speculation about lost Templar treasures ever since. Of course, there is one very plausible way in which a large amount of Templar treasure might have mysteriously vanished in 1307. Philip the Fair demonstrated very clearly throughout his reign that, if there was one thing he was really good at, it was making large amounts of treasure disappear really quickly. So, were the Templars guilty of heresy and demon worship? Or were they the innocent victims of Philip the Fair's Machiavellian scheming? Given the evidence and what we know of Philip the Fair, the latter would seem to be by far the most likely scenario. It is, let's be honest, tempting to want to believe all the romantic tales of sinister occult rites, demon worship, secretive esoteric orders, and lost treasures. A story about a greedy, ruthless king is far less glamorous, even if it is far more realistic. On October 30th, 1501, the most decadent of festivals occurred in the papal palace of Cardinal Cesare Borgia. A party that his own father, Pope Alexander VI, not only attended but participated in. The banquet of chestnuts was rumored to contain decadent food and wine, invigorating music and dance, and an unending orgy with Rome's most exclusive courtesans known as the cortigiana. It is said that all clergy were required to enjoy indulgences and participate in the Pope's fetish for male virility in sexual ejaculative prowess. This sinful part took place the day before All Hallows, Halloween, which was a sanctified holiday dedicated to the dead. It is said that all clergy were required to enjoy indulgences and participate in the Pope's fetish for male virility in sexual ejaculative prowess. This sinful part took place the day before All Hallows, Halloween, which was a sanctified holiday dedicated to the dead. This night in October 1501 became the most infamous party known as the Banquet of Chestnuts, due to the acts of the dancing courtesans picking up the chestnuts thrown on the floor by the eagerly perverse attending clergymen. And it's a decadent party that is still gossiped about today. The Banquet of Chestnuts was so notorious that scholars, writers, and bloggers to this day gossip about it as if it happened in the current era. Since this one event, the Catholic Church now collaborates with historians to disprove the debaucherously infamous party since it represents the hypocrisy and sacrilege to everything the Church stands for. What makes this banquet most fascinating is that it defines the Borgia family, what all believed they stood for, and their nepotic hold over the papal church. However, a more detailed examination of this event reveals that most of the accounts are based on one diary entry written by the banquet's master of ceremonies Liber Notarum Johann Burchard, a man who was considered no friend of the Borgias. Whether this event was as scandalous as many scholars have made it out to be, or whether this is nothing more than an example of slander against the Borgias is continually debated. A closer look can help us separate fact from fiction. During the 15th and 16th centuries, the House of Borgia, a prominent noble family from Aragon, Spain, became intertwined in the political affairs of the Church. Their notoriety increased along with their popularity when Alphonse de Borja was elected pope and renamed Pope Calixtus III, ruled 1455 to 1458. It wasn't until 1492 that Rodrigo Lanzal Borgia became Pope Alexander VI. However, his reign, though only 11 years, was the most infamous of any Borgia. Pope Alexander VI was considered one of the most corrupt popes in all of Catholic history. His name was associated with incest, adultery, bribery, and murder. In the House of Borgia's rise to the papal office, several other families, such as the Medici and Sforza families, became sudden enemies of the Borgias. Alexander VI was also known for selling official positions within the church and securing power and wealth only for the House of Borgia. This reason, above all else, was why the House of Borgia also had enemies within the church. With such hate built from prominent families and high-ranking officials of the church, there was a strong motive for scholars to portray the House of Borgia as decadent and sinful. The Banquet of Chestnuts is referenced as the most famous example of what was wrong with the Borgia family. Most accounts of this event came from the diary entry of the banquet's master of ceremonies, Johann Burchard, who attended the banquet and was a witness to what happened that night. In his diary entry, Burchard mentioned that 50 honest courtesans were present. They acted as dancers, entertainers, conversationalists, and servers. But as the night continued, according to Burchard, their garments fell away with each passing hour until they were completely nude. Once their clothes were off, the games with chestnuts began. Burchard detailed how eager clergymen would throw chestnuts on the floor for the naked courtesans to acquire. They would crawl on their arms and knees and pick up the chestnuts in their mouths. Then the sexual contests would begin where clergymen would have to endure in sexual intercourse. Whoever lasted the longest was considered the winner. Burchard's accounts are very vivid. However, his entries are also strongly contested due to his well-known dislike of Pope Alexander VI, a Borgia. Because of Burchard's bias, many historians have discounted his writings regarding the banquet of chestnuts, even though this single party became the most notorious banquet of all medieval history. The banquet of chestnuts took place the night before All Hallows Festival, Halloween, and this could have been a reason why the banquet of chestnuts was portrayed the way it was. The importance of the All Hallows Festival in medieval Europe is strongly tied to Celtic and pagan festivals. These festivals gained in popularity with other cultures and eventually were incorporated into the Christian calendar. On October 31st, people were expected to feast in celebration of the Christian saints, commemorate dead loved ones of the past, offer flowers and rituals within graveyards, and celebrate both for those who are alive and those who are dead. As writer Carlin Beccia mentions, the All Hallows Festival was a certified church holiday that carried ties to the dead. In medieval Rome, cadavers were dressed in the best garments their living relatives could afford and placed on display. People would dress up as both spirits and saints to signify the unity of the living and the dead, and farmers and craftsmen alike would celebrate the end of a productive and bountiful year, providing no end of excess to all who attended. In many ways, the celebration of life, abundance, and joy was significant to the hardships faced during the medieval era. The All Hallows festivals in Rome would also be where the rich and wealthy would compete for the most luxurious of parties, exclusive to those who were well connected. As the commoners masqueraded in the streets, the wealthy held the largest of events where performers, courtesans, and entertainers would stage elaborate shows around tables overflowing with food and wine. As Pope Alexander VI hoped to gain further favor with the Church, he may have felt that the Borgia celebrations should be the very best of all. Perhaps the banquet of chestnuts was symbolic of all these rituals, since it contained both a grand feast for all, as well as an appreciation for life and all of its vices. Whichever the case, the diary entries by Burchard have often been dismissed as the writings of a bitter foe to the Borgias. Since October 31, 1501, as Beccia writes, historians have continued to debate whether the scandalous orgies of the banquet of chestnuts were indeed accurate or an exaggeration by a resentful Burchard. In Beccia's essay, she provides another source that places Burchard's description into question. The Italian condottiere Silvio Savelli also attended the banquet, yet in a letter he wrote, Savelli only mentioned that the courtesans dined with the Borgias and their guests without any mention of sexual sin. If anything, Savelli went on to mention that the courtesans were great conversationalists who greeted guests with a most shocking sight. What that sight was, alas, will be forever lost to history and hearsay. Avignon Papacy, Roman Catholic papacy during the period 1309–77, when the popes took up residence at Avignon, France, instead of at Rome. The move represented a significant political victory for Philip IV of France in his long and, at times, violent conflict with the Roman papacy. Although the Avignon papacy was overwhelmingly French in complexion, all 7 of the popes during the period were French, as were 111 of the 134 cardinals created. It was not so responsive to French pressure as contemporaries assumed or as later critics insisted. During this time the Sacred College of Cardinals began to gain a stronger role in the government of the Church, a vast reorganization and centralization of administrative offices and other agencies was effected, reform measures for the clergy were initiated, expanded missionary enterprises, which reached as far as China, were stimulated, university education was promoted, and numerous attempts were made by the popes to settle royal rivalries and to establish peace. Nevertheless, the antagonism, especially within England and Germany, to the residency at Avignon damaged the prestige of the papacy, and the so-called Babylonian captivity of the Curia would lead directly to the Great Western Schism. Clement V was elected pope in June 1305, largely through the machinations of Philip IV, after the death of Benedict XI in July 1304. Clement chose Lyon to be the site of his coronation, November 1305, with a view to conciliate Philip, who was still pursuing a posthumous vendetta against Benedict's predecessor, Boniface VIII. As such, Clement's early papacy was spent undoing Boniface's legacy in an attempt to appease Philip. From 1307 onward Philip also pursued the destruction of the Templars, quite possibly to gain control of the militant order's vast wealth, and he eventually accused the knights of heresy. In 1308 Clement summoned a council to meet at Vienne, Dauphiné, in order to settle the issue. It was the prospect of this council that prompted Clement to select Avignon for his residence. He arrived there on March 9, 1309. Avignon, a possession of the Angevin counts of Provence and kings of Naples, stood on the Rhone adjacent to the Comtat Venaissin, which had been in possession of the popes since 1274. Midway between France and Italy, on a great trade route, the town guarded the southernmost of the rare bridges over the Rhone, and it was reasonably near the sea. Avignon, indeed, was a more suitable center for church administration than Rome, if history was forgotten and the existing balance of power in Europe taken principally into account. Neither Rome nor Italy was safe for prolonged sojourn, and politically France now bulked largest. In view of this French predominance, Clement V had at first supported the election of Henry of Luxembourg as German king, Henry VII, in 1308, but as the result of the Council of Vienne and French pressure in favor of Robert, the Angevin king of Naples, Clement came around to the anti-imperial side, of which the main organizer was Florence. Thus when, in 1313, Henry prepared for war against Robert, Clement threatened Henry with excommunication. With his ally Frederick III of Sicily, Henry might have conquered the Angevin had he not succumbed to fever in August 1313. Clement, claiming to rule while the empire was vacant, gave Robert the title of imperial vicar in Italy. Robert, however, spent his treasure and forces upon assaults on Sicily, lost control of the Romagna, and never made much impression in Lombardy, where the Visconti and the Scaligers retained power in Milan and Verona, respectively. Clement died in April 1314. An adroit but timid and physically ailing pontiff, he had been obliged to consent to the destruction of the Templars, whom he himself dissolved, so as not to leave their extinction to Philip IV, and to erase from the papal registers all apostolic letters against Philip IV and his agents. Only in the War of Ferrara, 1309, against the Venetians did he have any success. He left a notable memorial of himself by adding the Clementini to the existing body of canon law. He was a confirmed nepotist, with apparently a large secret treasure. His treated his private resources and the funds of the apostolic camera as a single unit, which he kept under the control of his family and on which he drew to make substantial presents to his relatives. Clement's successor, elected after an interval of 2 years and 3 months, was John XXII, another French pope, who left a permanent mark on the later medieval papacy. Formerly Chancellor of the Angevin Charles II of Naples, John touched the political and intellectual life of Europe at many points. He opposed the spiritual Franciscans, a group who espoused an extreme version of the vows of austerity and poverty prescribed in the original rule of St. Francis. In this, as in his doctrine of the beatific vision, the experience of God by the souls of the blessed in the afterlife, John aroused a great deal of theological antagonism and was unfortunate in having as his opponents such luminaries as Michael of Cesena, general of the Franciscan order, and William of Ockham. In 1322 John revoked the bull Exiat Caseminat, 1279, of Nicholas III, which, by declaring the possessions of the Franciscans to be the property of the papacy, had enabled the order to claim total poverty while its use of the papal property was sanctioned. With the bull Cum Inter non nullos, 1323, John declared the Franciscan doctrine that Jesus and his apostles lived in absolute poverty to be heretical. As a result Michael of Cesena, Ockham, and others took refuge with John's enemy Louis IV the Bavarian. At Munich a new factory of anti-papal argument and propaganda came into being, encouraged by the revolutionary thinking of Marsilius of Padua, who looked upon the church as the pars sacerdotalis, priestly department, of the state. The intellectual attack on John was pressed by Occam, whose polemical works are dominated by the thought that the papacy under John did not possess the magisterium in Christian teaching but was emitting views that were plainly heretical. John entered into a fierce quarrel with the empire and began a long series of military and diplomatic actions in Italy to uproot Ghibellinism, the anti-papal imperial party, and prepare the way for a return to Rome. At the imperial election of October 1314, 5 electors had chosen the Wittelsbach candidate Louis the Bavarian, while the remaining 4 voted for Frederick of Habsburg, Duke of Austria. John, on becoming pope, viewed with alarm the possibility of a new imperial intervention in Italy, and he thought it safest to keep the empire vacant, as Clement had done, until he could decide the issue between the 2 claimants. Meanwhile he maintained Robert of Naples as imperial vicar in Italy. Louis the Bavarian's victory over Frederick of Habsburg at Muldorf, 1322, was alarming to John, and his suspicions were confirmed by the fact that Louis sent a vicar to Italy to help the Ghibellines in Milan and Verona. In October 1323 John declared Louis guilty of acting as king of the Romans before his election was confirmed by the Pope and of helping heretics by aiding the Visconti of Milan. Louis was ordered within 3 months to surrender his title, and his subjects were to renounce him under pain of excommunication and forfeiture. The German ruler retorted in January 1324 by declaring the independence of the empire and the sufficiency of his election and coronation to make him king of the Romans without papal approval. On March 23, 1324, John excommunicated Louis. In the course of his Italian expedition, 1327–30, Louis reached Rome and was crowned emperor by 4 lay syndics of the Roman people, headed by Sciarra Colonna. An antipope, Nicholas V, Pietro Reinalducci, was elected in May 1328, but the expedition achieved little else, since John continued to insist on the nullity of an election unconfirmed by the papacy. There would be no settlement of the quarrel while John was alive. After his death, indignation with his policy provoked the German princes to declare at Rents that the chosen of the electors was king of the Romans without need of papal confirmation, 1338. The Pope found the Ghibellines of northern Italy no less intractable. The Visconti and the Scaligers, della Scala, remained unmoved by excommunication, and John had to send the warrior legate Bertrand du Pouget to resolve the situation. He also appealed to Philip V of France, who authorized Philip of Valois, the future Philip VI of France, to descend into Italy, 1320. Philip, instead of fighting Galeazzo Visconti, parleyed with him. Later, Philip excused himself to the French king on the ground that neither John nor Robert of Anjou, who was pledged to help him, had sent him any money. The Visconti seized Vercelli, 1321, and Cremona, 1322, and the Pope tried without success to tempt Frederick of Austria to rescue the position. Despite the Ghibelline recovery, the legate was successful in forming a Guelph, pro-papacy, nucleus in Parma, Modena, Reggio, and Bologna. It was suggested that a new North Italian kingdom might be constituted for John of Bohemia, Henry VII's son, who in 1330 went to Italy to help the Brescians against Mastino della Scala. But the Italian powers took fright. Guelph and Ghibelline alike formed, in 1332, the League of Ferrara to expel the invader, and the papal and legatine forces were twice defeated in 1333, at Ferrara and at Argenta. John of Bohemia left Italy, and the legate, against whom Bologna had revolted in 1334, had to make his escape to Avignon. The 14 years of warfare had cost John XXII more than half the revenues of his pontificate, though he had at least asserted the power of the Church in northern Italy, even if unsuccessfully. His general administration contributed substantially to the development of the papal bureaucracy. Under his rule the Roman Curia became fixed at Avignon. The episcopal palace where John lived was a powerfully defended fortress. The atmosphere of security guaranteed the untroubled working of the monarchical centralization. The Avignonese system, complicated as it grew to be, was founded upon 2 simple administrative acts, a petition to the Pope and the papal reply, in the form of a grant of some license, dispensation, or favor in the shape of office or benefice. The recipient was willing, and obliged, to pay the fees laid down, both to the chancery and to other authorized agents. The most common form of petition was for the papal collation of a benefice, whether a canonry with or without a prebend or a church, i.e., parish church, or other emolument. But the issue of letters of provision did not necessarily imply that the petitioner got the benefice for which he asked. The executors of the provisions, generally clerks of the diocese named, might find that the benefice was already filled or that obstacles were encountered against which litigation had to be commenced. At the same time the Pope steadily increased the categories of reservations, from those benefices which fell vacant by their holders dying within a given distance of the Roman Curia. John XXI saw the need of advance by stages. In the Constitution ex debito of 1316 he extended reservation to several categories of benefices over and above those which were vacants in Curia, those of which the holder had died in Rome. The Constitution ex Equabilis, 1317, forbidding a clerk to hold more than one living, placed in the hands of the Roman Curia the collation of the benefice that the pluralist clerk was forced to resign. At Avignon the plenitude of power was asserted not so much politically as administratively, and petitioning became a skilled technique, for the system of granting benefices was regulated by the delicately adjusted rules of the apostolic chancery. The livings or offices, whether conferred in consistory, appointments in collegiate churches, or by ordinary process of assented petition, involved, in addition to the fees, payments to the apostolic camera and to the camera cardinalium, called servitia, services, and annates, respectively. The latter were paid on simple benefices, the higher benefices involved both the great and the little servitia. Gathered locally by papal collectors, the payments were frequently advanced by papal merchants who satisfied the needs of the pope and cardinals for ready money and retained the papal grant until they had secured from the grantee binding agreements to pay, obligations, approved by the curia. This development of papal finance and, in particular, the help of the mercators domini papae, papal merchants, enabled John XXII to finance his military enterprises in Italy. The Chamberlain Gaspard de Laval, 1319-47, acted both as administrator and diplomatic counselor and was responsible for many of these developments. The system of collectories, areas into which Christendom was divided for the collection of papal duties, was promoted by him. It did not, however, function until the middle of the 14th century. In addition to the expansion of the chancery and of the exchequer and the growth of the papal palladium, law court, the papal penitentiary dealt with those ecclesiastical offences, the absolution of which was reserved to the Holy See, and, through its local penitentiaries, exercised the power of binding and loosing vested in the pope. The whole edifice was kept together by the collaboration of the cardinals, who had come to be the pope's sole counselors when seated with him in consistory. It was during the Avignonese period that the aristocratic theory of their necessary cooperation and consent in all major papal acts undoubtedly developed. On his death John XXII was succeeded by Benedict XII, a French theologian devoted to the reform of the religious orders. The bull Summi Magistri, 1336, dealt in its 39 chapters with all the main aspects of the religious life of the Order of Saint Benedict, its government, the regime of the convents, its temporal possessions, and its studies. The Pope was also much concerned to remedy abuses in the secular clergy. In view of his reforming activity, it is not surprising that Benedict was the object of calumny. He was accused of avarice, egoism, prejudice, dislike of the cardinals, and hatred of the mendicants. Perhaps surprisingly, the reform-minded Benedict began work on a papal palace separate from the bishop's residence at Avignon. No longer was the see of Avignon kept vacant and administered by the Bishop of Marseilles. Around the court of the old episcopal palace he constructed a building that resembled both a monastery and a fortress, yet one suitable for the expanding curia. In 1339 he transferred to it the papal archives, which had been at Assisi since the pontificate of Benedict XI. It was the French Benedictine Clement VI who, in June 1348, took the step of purchasing Avignon for 80,000 florins from Joan I of Naples. He also built on to Benedict's palace a second that was less austere and more fitted to his grandiose conception of the papacy. Already in Benedict's time Sienese artists, in particular Simone Martini, had been brought to decorate the churches at Avignon. Clement charged Matteo Giovanelli of Viterbo and Lippo Memmi with the decoration of chapels in the new palace and had his apartments lined with tapestries from the north. The galleries and halls were filled with ornaments and rich furniture, new plants and strange animals appeared in the gardens, and Hebrew manuscripts and translations from the Arabic were added to the library. The influence of humanism was making itself felt. Clement VI, a clear-headed, Renaissance type of pontiff, took office in 1342, and he was confronted by three problems: a crusade, the failure of the Florentine bankers, and the state of the Italian possessions of the Holy See. The Anglo-French struggle was likely to be long, it became the 100 Years' War, and hamper attempts to relieve the last Christian states left in the east, the kingdoms of Lesser Armenia and of Cyprus. Clement thought of the crusade as the Pope's first duty and made himself responsible for an expedition that was successful in taking Smyrna, 1344. Later, to Clement's indignation, the Latins of the East traded the place for a precarious peace with the Turks and for guarantees against piracy. Finance, because of the Florentine bankruptcies, was an acute problem. Clement had to look outside Florence for his bankers, and on certain occasions had to employ 11 banks to send his military commanders in Italy sums varying from 20,000 to 40,000 florins. But these were failures of mechanism rather than of revenue. The pontiff was able to lend the King of France no less than 600,000 florins from the secret account. All that could be got was needed to meet the situation in Italy. The papal territories in Romagna and the Marches were disputed by the noble Italian families, whereas the patrimony was menaced by Giovanni di Vico, the prefect of Rome. Clement's nephew Astorge de Durfort was sent to re-establish the authority of the Holy See in the Romagna. Clement was also concerned with Naples and with affairs in Rome. In Naples he strove to ensure that justice was done to Queen Joan, who was suspected of the murder of her husband, Andrew of Hungary. In Rome he at first supported, 1343, the popular leader Cola di Rienzo in his attempt to create an orderly bourgeois state based upon the ancient Roman Republic. After 1347 Cola's plans went beyond the establishment of order and suppression of the nobles and displayed a dangerous revivalism embodying a federation of Italy in which all Italians must be Roman citizens. Clement became alarmed and refused more support. The next pontificate, that of Innocent VI, saw the Italian campaigns of Gil Alvarez Carrillo de Albornoz, the fighting cardinal who revived the papal state and made possible the return of the Pope to Rome. Sent as legate to the Romagna and to the March of Ancona, he quickly dealt with Giovanni di Vico, 1354, and reduced the whole patrimony and Umbria to order. In 1355 the Malatesta family surrendered and received back some of their dominions as papal vicars. The Duchy of Spoleto and the March of Ancona were both recovered in 1355. In 1357 Cesena was captured. Further success was for the time undermined by the intrigues at Avignon of Bernabo Visconti, who was trying to secure Bologna. In 1363 Bernabo was defeated, but Urban V decided not to break up the Visconti state. Had he done so, the later threat of Visconti domination over the city-states of Tuscany and central Italy might have been avoided. The last two pontiffs in the undisputed Avignon line, Urban V, a French Benedictine, and Gregory XI, the last French pope, were neither politicians nor administrators but intellectuals. Both were men of great piety, and Urban was generally accounted an austere saint. It was he who took the decision, in 1365, to bring the Curia back to Rome. He was greatly concerned to reunite the Eastern and Western churches and hoped to enter into conversations with the Patriarch of Constantinople. He could not do this so well from Avignon as from Rome. Leaving Avignon on April 30, 1367, and reaching Rome on October 16, Urban installed himself in the Vatican, but he did not remain there long. When the Anglo-French War flared up again, the Pope thought it best to return to Avignon, where negotiations could be more easily undertaken with the warring kings. On September 27, 1370, Urban was back at Avignon. Gregory XI had reached the conclusion that, to conduct negotiations with the Eastern Church and to maintain the papal territories, consolidation by Albornoz and residents at Rome were necessary. But by proposing this at a time when the apostolic treasury was almost empty, while a large proportion of the personnel of the papal civil service was Southern French by origin, Gregory aroused a good deal of criticism. He delayed his departure, however, while he tried to bring about a truce in the Anglo-French struggle and convert it into a definite peace. But events in the east, particularly the conquest of Lesser Armenia by the Mamluks, 1375, were pressing. On top of these happenings came the attempt of Florence to organize a league against the Pope and at the expense of papal territory. In the War of the Eight Saints, 1375, named after the Council of Florentine magistrates who conducted the campaign, Florence secured the revolt of Bologna and other papal towns. The ecclesiastical territories would have been lost had it not been for the vigorous action of Gregory and of his legate, Robert of Geneva, later the antipope Clement VII. The move to Rome in January 1377 was essentially sound and can even be said to have saved the papal state. Gregory, however, did not live to see the result. Gregory died in 1378, and cardinals of the Sacred College selected a second pope, who assumed the vacant Avignon seat. This marked the onset of the Great Western Schism. A succession of such antipopes were selected, and the schism was not healed until 1417. The increased power and ambitions of the cardinals had led to the schism and the subsequent emergence of conciliarism, a theory that a general council of the Church has greater authority than the Pope and may, if necessary, depose him. Western Schism, in the history of the Roman Catholic Church, the period from 1378 to 1417, when there were two, and later three, rival popes, each with his own following, his own sacred college of cardinals, and his own administrative offices. Shortly after the return of the papal residents to Rome following almost 70 years of the Avignon papacy, the Archbishop of Bari was elected pope as Urban VI amid demands by the Roman populace for a Roman or at least an Italian. Urban VI proved to be so hostile to the cardinals, who had assumed great powers during the years at Avignon, that a group of cardinals retired to Anagni and elected one of themselves, Robert of Geneva, as Clement VII, claiming the election of Urban VI had been invalid because it was made under fear. Clement VII then took up residence at Avignon. Although Roman Catholic Church historians generally agree that Urban VI and his successors were the legitimate popes, there has never been an official pronouncement to this effect. The double election had disastrous effects upon the Church. The followers of the two popes were divided chiefly along national lines, and thus the dual papacy fostered the political antagonisms of the time. The spectacle of rival popes denouncing each other produced great confusion and resulted in a tremendous loss of prestige for the papacy. Various proposals for ending the schism were made, especially by the University of Paris, which suggested either mutual resignation or a decision by an independent tribunal or a general council. This last proposal was in line with the growing conciliar movement, according to which a general council has greater authority than a pope. Both lines of popes refused to submit. Eventually cardinals from both obediences, seeking to end the schism, arranged the Council of Pisa, which met in 1409 and elected a third pope, Alexander V, who was succeeded shortly thereafter by Baldassare Casa, who took the name John XXAI. Under pressure from the Emperor Sigismund, John convoked, in 1414, the Council of Constance, which deposed him, received the resignation of the Roman Pope, Gregory XII, and dismissed the claims of the Avignon Pope, Benedict XIII. That series of events opened the way to the election of Martin V in November 1417, whereby the schism was ended. Babylonian captivity, the forced detention of Jews in Babylonia following the Neo-Babylonian Empire's conquest of the Kingdom of Judah in 598/7 and 587/6 BCE. The captivity formally ended in 538 BCE, when the Persian conqueror of Babylonia, Cyrus the Great, gave the Jews permission to return to Palestine. Historians agree that several deportations took place, each the result of uprisings in Palestine, that not all Jews were forced to leave their homeland, that returning Jews left Babylonia at various times, and that some Jews chose to remain in Babylonia, thus constituting the first of numerous Jewish communities living permanently in the diaspora. Many scholars cite 597 BCE as the date of the first deportation, for in that year King Jehoiakim was deposed and apparently sent into exile with his family, his court, and thousands of workers. Others say the first deportation followed the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadrezzar in 586, if so, the Jews were held in Babylonian captivity for 48 years. Among those who accept a tradition, Jeremiah 29 verse 10, that the exile lasted 70 years, some choose the dates 608 to 538, others 586 to about 516, the year when the rebuilt temple was dedicated in Jerusalem. Although the Jews suffered greatly and faced powerful cultural pressures in a foreign land, they maintained their national spirit and religious identity. Elders supervised the Jewish communities, and Ezekiel was one of several prophets who kept alive the hope of one day returning home. This was possibly also the period when synagogues were first established, for the Jews observed the Sabbath and religious holidays, practiced circumcision, and substituted prayers for former ritual sacrifices in the temple. The degree to which the Jews looked upon Cyrus the Great as their benefactor and a servant of their God is reflected at several points in the Hebrew Bible, e.g., at Isaiah, where he is actually called God's anointed. Philip IV, born 1268, Fontainebleau, France, died November 29, 1314, Fontainebleau, was the king of France from 1285 to 1314, and of Navarre, as Philip I, from 1284 to 1305, ruling jointly with his wife, Joan I of Navarre. His long struggle with the Roman papacy ended with the transfer of the Curia to Avignon, France, beginning the so-called Babylonian captivity, 1309–77. He also secured French royal power by wars on barons and neighbors and by restriction of feudal usages. His three sons were successively kings of France, Louis X, Philip V, and Charles IV. Born at Fontainebleau while his grandfather was still ruling, Philip, the second son of Philip III, the Bold, and grandson of St. Louis, Louis IX, was not yet 3 when his mother, Isabella of Aragon, died on her return from the crusade on which Louis IX had perished. The motherless Philip and his 3 brothers saw little of their father, who, stricken by Isabella's death, threw himself into campaigning and administrative affairs. His troubled childhood and the series of blows he suffered explain in some measure the conflicting elements in his adult personality. In 1274 his father married Marie de Brabant, a beautiful and cultivated woman, and, with her arrival at court, intrigue began to flourish. In the same year, the 2-year-old Joan, heiress of Champagne and Navarre, was welcomed as a refugee. Reared with the royal children, she would, when she was 12, become the bride of Philip the Fair. In 1276 Philip's elder brother, Louis, died, and the shock of this event, which suddenly made Philip heir to the kingdom, was compounded by persistent rumors of poisoning and suspicions that Philip's stepmother intended to see Isabella's remaining sons destroyed. Vague allegations were circulated that Louis's death was linked with certain unspecified, unnatural acts of his father. Far-flung tribunals had gathered enough materials to cast doubts on the Templars' dedication, and, although not condemned as heretical, the order was quashed and its property assigned to the Knights Hospitallers. Whatever Philip's reasons for launching his attack against the order, his action brought him substantial financial gain despite Clement V's repeated attempts to protect the Templars' interests. During the interwar years, Philip asserted his independence of the Holy Roman Empire in diplomatic exchanges with imperial princes and the emperors themselves. He also fortified his eastern border by arranging marriages for his sons that extended French influence over the county of Burgundy and by exerting his authority over the city of Lyon. Less successful were his attempts to implement his dream of gaining control of the empire. He failed to have his brother Charles elected emperor in 1308, nor did he succeed on behalf of his second son, Philip, in 1313. This disappointment presaged the troubles of Philip's last year as king. In June 1313 his fortunes had reached a high point. Having knighted his sons, taken the Crusaders' cross, and issued coinage reform ordinances, he witnessed the triumphal departure of his sons against the Flemish, who had been excommunicated for their failure to observe the Treaty of 1305. When the Flemish capitulated and accepted a truce, Philip magnanimously ordered the return of money collected for the army. After these successes and demonstrations of royal grace, 1314 brought only troubles. Philip's stubborn resolve to defend morality and the faith was shown when, with royal acquiescence, the Grand Master of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake after retracting his earlier confession. Far graver were the public trial and execution of two young squires convicted of adultery with Philip's daughters-in-law. The death of Clement V was another blow, but an even greater one was the fresh uprising by the Flemish. With his subjects' agreement, Philip mounted another campaign, but the negotiation of a truce caused difficulties. There were rumors of treason involving one of Philip's ministers and insistent demands for the restitution of all money collected for the war. Philip, who needed the funds, delayed, and a coordinated movement of opposition developed. Nobles in northern and eastern France presented their grievances to the king, who by early November was lying ill at Poissy, St. Louis's birthplace, recovering from a minor stroke. Having regained strength, he traveled to his own birthplace, Fontainebleau, and there, a day before his death, he halted collection of his last tax and provided for a crusading expedition to be conducted in his name. Philip was aloof, sternly reserved, and physically striking, tall, fine-featured, and blond, hence his name, the Fair. Frankly enjoying the trappings of monarchy, he built and maintained the palaces befitting his estate, but his chief concern was for the dignity of his office. He believed that he and his kingdom were guarded by God and chosen as special defenders of the Catholic faith. He valued the curative powers that he believed God's grace had given him. Proud of his orthodoxy and inspired by a priestly sense of mission, he was receptive to accusations of sin and heresy leveled against others, and he prosecuted ruthlessly those charged with such failings. A visionary idealist, he also possessed a fundamental sense of the possible and the necessary, and those of his grandiose schemes that exceeded the bounds of practicality were abandoned. As authoritarian and determined as he sometimes appeared, he lacked the firmness and independence of judgment that a surer sense of confidence in himself might have afforded him. He often turned for guidance to the intelligent and able ministers whom he promoted and protected, and he solicited the support of his subjects, who were called together with unprecedented frequency to endorse and sometimes to help construct royal policy. Such consultation may have been politically expedient, but, like the expressions of reassurance obtained from spiritual authorities, it also served to convince Philip of the legitimacy of his actions. Philip was, by all accounts, an impressive ruler. Some Italian writers detested him and his line, but most contemporaries acknowledged his piety and good intentions, although many of them disapproved of his wars, his taxes, and his influential advisors. In the later years of the 14th century, when memory of these sources of complaint had faded, his reign was considered a golden age of freedom from burdensome and unjust taxation. Historians of recent times have differed in their judgments, and nationalistic and ecclesiastical biases have affected many assessments. It now seems possible to conclude, however, that the most striking accomplishments of his reign bear the ultimate impress of the complex personality of a scrupulous, suspicious, rigorous, visionary, determined man who fervently believed himself called by God to act as judge of the morals and welfare of his subjects. Papacy, the office and jurisdiction of the Pope, Latin Papa, from Greek papas, father, who presides over the Holy See, the central government, of the Roman Catholic Church, the largest of the three major branches of Christianity. The term pope was originally applied to all the bishops in the Western Church. In 1073, however, Pope Gregory VII restricted its use to the Bishop of Rome, confirming a practice that had existed since the 9th century. The term is also used to describe the Patriarch of Alexandria, now leader of the Coptic Orthodox Church, who still retains the title. According to the Annuario Pontificio, the papal annual, there have been more than 260 popes since St. Peter, traditionally considered the first pope. Among these, 83 have been proclaimed saints, as have some antipopes, rival claimants to the papal throne who were appointed or elected in opposition to the legitimate pope. The Annuario Pontificio does not identify popes by consecutive number, having stated that at times the legitimate succession between multiple claimants was impossible to determine. Most holders of the office have been Roman or Italian, with a sprinkling of other Europeans, including one Pole, and one Latin American pope. All have been male, though the legend of a female Pope Joan appeared in the 13th century. During the course of the 2,000 years in which the papal system and the practice of electing popes in the papal conclave have evolved, the papacy has played a crucial role in both Western and world history. The history of the papacy can be divided into 5 major periods. The early papacy, from St. Peter through Pelagius II, until 590. The medieval papacy, from St. Gregory I through Boniface VIII, 590 to 1303. The Renaissance and Reformation papacy, from Benedict XI through Pius IV, 1303 to 1565. The early modern papacy, from St. Pius V through Clement XIV, 1566 to 1774. The modern papacy, from Pius VI, 1775 to the 21st century. Apart from the allusion to Rome in the first letter of Peter, there is no historical evidence that St. Peter was Rome's first bishop or that he was martyred in Rome. According to tradition, he was crucified upside down, during a persecution of the Christians in the mid-60s CE. By the end of the 1st century, however, his presence in the imperial capital was recognized by Christian leaders, and the city was accorded a place of honor, perhaps because of its claim to the graves of both Saints Peter and Paul. In 1939 what were believed to be Peter's bones were found under the altar of the basilica dedicated to him, and in 1965 Pope Paul VI, 1963-78, confirmed them as such. Rome's primacy was also fostered by its many martyrs, its defense of orthodoxy, and its status as the capital of the Roman Empire. By the end of the 2nd century, Rome's stature was further bolstered by the Petrine theory, which claims that Jesus Christ had designated Peter to be his representative on earth and the leader of the Church, and that this ministry was passed on to Peter's successors as bishops of Rome. Peter received this authority, according to the theory, when Jesus referred to him as the rock of the Church and said to him, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." The Roman position of honor was challenged in the middle of the 3rd century when Pope Stephen I, 254-257, and Saint Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, clashed over Stephen's claim to doctrinal authority over the universal Church. Nonetheless, in the critical period between Popes Damasus I, 366-384, and Leo I, 440-461, 9 popes made a strong case for Rome's supremacy, despite a growing challenge from the See of Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Empire. Leo, one of only 3 popes accorded the appellation, the Great, played a pivotal role in the early history of the papacy. Assuming the title Pontifex Maximus, or chief priest, he made an important distinction between the person of the pope and his office, maintaining that the office assumed the full power bestowed on Peter. Although the Council of Chalcedon, called and largely directed by the Eastern Emperor Marcian in 451, accorded the Patriarch of Constantinople the same primacy in the East that the Bishop of Rome held in the West, it acknowledged that Leo I spoke with the voice of Peter on matters of dogma, thus encouraging papal primacy. The link between Peter and the office of the Bishop of Rome was stressed by Pope Gelasius I, 492-496, who was the first pope to be referred to as the Vicar of Christ. In his Theory of the Two Swords, Gelasius articulated a dualistic power structure, insisting that the pope embodied spiritual power and the emperor embodied temporal power. This position, which was supported by Pope Pelagius I, 556-561, became an important part of medieval ecclesiology and political theory. Although much about the early popes remains shrouded in darkness, scholars agree that the bishops of Rome were selected in the same manner as other bishops, that is, elected by the clergy and people of the area, though there is some evidence that some of the early bishops attempted to appoint their successors. Elections were not always peaceful, however, and rival candidates and factions often prompted imperial intervention. Eventually, the emperors presided over elections. After the collapse of the Western Empire in 476, the involvement of the Eastern Emperor in papal affairs was gradually replaced by that of Germanic rulers and leading Roman families. As political instability plagued the Old Western Empire in the early Middle Ages, popes were often forced to make concessions to temporal authorities in exchange for protection. After the demise of effective Byzantine control of Italy in the 8th century, the papacy appealed to the new Germanic rulers for support, serving as a symbol of imperial glory for them. Pope Gregory I, 590-604, the first of the medieval popes and the second pope deemed great, faced numerous challenges during his reign, including plague, famine, and threats from the Byzantines and the Lombards, a Germanic people who invaded Italy in the 6th century. Although he believed that he was part of a Christian commonwealth headed by the Byzantine emperor, Gregory turned the papacy's attention to the Germanic peoples who succeeded the Romans as rulers of the Western Empire. In this fashion he opened up the West to the papacy. Among the many important accomplishments of Gregory's reign were his efforts to stop the Lombard advance and to convert the invaders from Arian Christianity to Catholic Christianity, his reorganization of the vast estates of the papacy, his contribution to the development of medieval spirituality, his numerous writings, such as the Moralia in Job, a moral commentary on the Book of Job, and his evangelistic mission to England. He also upheld Leo I's thesis that, because the papacy inherited the fullness of Peter's power, there could be no appeal of a ruling by the Pope. Despite Gregory's successful pontificate, the papacy's situation remained uncertain as Byzantine power in Italy receded and the Lombards continued to endanger Rome's security. The situation worsened in the 8th century after a new emperor, Leo III, restored sagging Byzantine fortunes by turning back an Arab assault from the east. Leo reorganized the empire and imposed new tax burdens on his Italian subjects. He also intervened in doctrinal matters by pronouncing, without papal approval, a policy of iconoclasm, in which he took a public stand against the perceived worship of religious images, icons. The new imperial fiscal and religious policies and limited imperial support against the Lombards drove the papacy to find a new protector. In 739 Pope Gregory III, 731–741, sent an unsuccessful appeal for aid to the Frankish mayor of the palace, the effective political power in the kingdom, Charles Martel. When the Lombards again threatened Rome, Pope Stephen II, or III, 752–757, fled to the Frankish kingdom and appealed to Pippin III, who in 751 had become the first Carolingian king of the Franks. In 754 Stephen formally crowned Pippin, and the king marched south with his army in that year and again in 756 to restore papal authority in central Italy. The king also issued the donation of Pippin, 756, to establish the papal states in central Italy, which endured until 1870. These events probably also inspired the compilation of the donation of Constantine, later proved to be a forgery, which asserted that the first Christian emperor, Constantine, granted control of the Western Empire to Pope Sylvester I, who had baptized the emperor and cured him of leprosy. It was later cited in support of papal claims of sovereignty in Western Europe. By linking the fate of Roman primacy to the support of Pippin and the Carolingian dynasty, Stephen and his successors gained a powerful protector. Indeed, a council regulating papal elections in 769 decreed that news of the Pope's election was to be transmitted to the Frankish court and no longer to Constantinople. The Frankish papal alliance was reinforced when Pope Leo III, 795–816, following a period of turmoil in Rome that was ended by Carolingian intervention, crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the Romans on Christmas Day, 800. Although the popes gained a measure of security from this relationship, they lost an equal measure of independence because the Carolingians followed in the footsteps of their Byzantine and Roman predecessors by asserting considerable control over the Frankish Church and the papacy itself. On the other hand, the Pope exercised influence in Carolingian affairs by maintaining the right to crown emperors and by sometimes directly intervening in political disputes. As Carolingian power waned in the late 9th and 10th centuries, the papacy once again found itself at the disposal of powerful local nobles, including the Crescentii family. Competition for control of the papal throne and its extensive network of patronage weakened the institution. Unsettled conditions in Rome drew the attention of Otto I, who revived Charlemagne's empire in 962 and required papal stability to legitimate his rule. In keeping with that goal, Otto deposed Pope John XII, 955–964, for moral turpitude. During the late 10th and 11th centuries, problems in the papal court and political conditions in Italy reinforced the close ties between the papacy and the German emperors, especially in the case of Pope Sylvester II, 999–1003, and Otto III. Despite this alliance, the emperor was often absent from Rome, and local powers reasserted themselves. At times, the papacy suffered from weakness and corruption. But even in the darkest times of the 10th and 11th centuries, Rome remained the focus of devotion and pilgrimage as the city of Peter and of the martyrs and saints. The 11th century was a time of revolutionary change in European society. In 1049 Pope Leo IX, 1049–54, joining a broad reform initiative that began in the early 10th century, introduced moral and institutional reforms at the Council of Reims, thus initiating the Gregorian reform movement, named after its most important leader, Pope Gregory VII, 1073–85. Reformers sought to restore the liberty and independence of the Church and to firmly distinguish the clergy from all other orders in society. Emphasizing the clergy's unique status and its awesome responsibility for the tending of individual souls, they attempted to put an end to the practices of simony, the buying or selling of spiritual offices, and clerical marriage. An important measure implemented by Pope Nicholas II, 1059–61, was the election decree of 1059, which organized the cardinals into a papal advisory body and laid the foundation for the creation of the Sacred College of Cardinals. The new body was vested with the right to name new popes, thus encouraging the independence of papal elections and restricting imperial interference. Further reforms emphasized the primacy of Rome and the subordination of all clergy and laity to the pope. Such assertions of papal primacy, however, worsened tensions between Rome and Constantinople and eventually brought about the schism of 1054 between the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. Another significant development brought about by the papal reform begun in 1049 was the investiture controversy. This struggle between Pope Gregory VII and King Henry IV of Germany erupted when Henry claimed the long-standing royal right to invest an ecclesiastical office holder with the symbols of power, thereby effectively maintaining control of the selection and direction of bishops and local clergy. The proper order of Christendom was at stake in the controversy. The papal position was elucidated in Gregory's Dictatus Papae, 1075, which emphasized the pope's place as the highest authority in the church. Although Gregory was driven from Rome and died in exile, his ideals eventually prevailed, as claims of sacral kingship and royal intervention in church affairs were seriously curtailed. Henry died under the ban of excommunication, and one of Gregory's successors, Urban II, 1088–99, restored Rome's prestige when he launched the First Crusade in 1095. The 12th century was a period of growth and transformation during which the impetus of Gregorian reform came to a close and the papacy adjusted to the new realities brought about by the events of the previous century. Traditionally the spiritual center of the Church, the papacy evolved into a great administrative and bureaucratic institution. Indeed, the papal court became, in some ways, the highest court of appeals, exercising jurisdiction in a broad range of legal matters and creating legal machinery of great sophistication. Whereas all roads once led to Rome for spiritual consolation, now they also led there for the adjudication of legal disputes. Not coincidentally, few popes in subsequent generations were listed among the ranks of the saints. The papacy also adjusted to changing social, religious, and political conditions, some of which were of its own making. The new electoral procedures instituted by the Gregorians only partially resolved questions relating to papal succession, and, as a result, the papacy suffered two schisms in the 12th century, the Anacletan and the Alexandrine. The latter was caused by renewed tensions between the papacy and the emperor, Frederick I Barbarossa, who eventually yielded to the legitimate pope, Alexander III, 1159–81. The Alexandrine schism led to the decision of the Third Lateran Council, 1179, to require a two-thirds majority vote of the cardinals to elect a pope. The papacy also faced challenges posed by the efforts of Italian cities to secure independence from imperial or episcopal control and by the growth of heresies, especially those of the Waldenses and the Albigenses. Innocent III, 1198–1216, responded with greater fervor to the challenges faced by the Church. One of the youngest popes to ascend the throne, Innocent, a theologian and lawyer, reinvigorated the institution. As the Vicar of Christ, he declared that the pope stood between God and humankind. He restored effective government over the papal states, and during his reign England, Bulgaria, and Portugal all became papal fiefs. Innocent expanded papal legal authority by claiming jurisdiction over matters relating to sin, and he involved himself in the political affairs of France and the Holy Roman Empire. He called the Fourth Crusade, 1202-04, which led to the sack of Constantinople, and the Albigensian Crusade, which was intended to end heresy in southern France, and he approved legislation requiring Jewish people to wear special clothing. Focusing also on spiritual matters, he approved the orders of Saint Francis of Assisi, the Franciscans, 1209, and Saint Dominic, the Dominicans, 1215, and he presided over the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which instituted various reforms and approved the use of the term transubstantiation to describe the transformation in which the bread and wine in the Eucharist becomes Christ's real presence, that is, his body and blood. In the 13th century, Innocent's successors continued his policies and further extended papal authority. The popes carried out the Inquisition and pursued a vendetta against the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick II, bringing to a close a struggle that had begun in the 11th century and that undermined imperial power for generations to come. The centralization of administrative and jurisdictional power in the Roman Curia, the body of officials that assists the Pope, however, led to increasing financial and administrative difficulties. To bring about reform, the pious hermit Pietro de Morone was elected as Pope Celestine V in 1294. Celestine was unequal to the task, however, and he resigned from the papal office in December of the same year. He was one of only a few popes to do so willingly. The next election brought to power one of the most extreme advocates of papal authority, Boniface VIII, 1294–1303. Although he was a brilliant lawyer, his obstinate personality led to a clash with the French king, Philip IV, which in turn brought about the collapse of the medieval papacy. Papal corruption and the humiliation of Boniface forced the papal court to move, under French influence, to Avignon in 1309. This so-called Babylonian captivity of the papacy lasted until 1377. The Avignon popes, though skilled administrators, were not distinguished by their piety. Indeed, John XXA, 1316–34, is best known for his battle with the spiritual Franciscans and his questionable views on the beatific vision, the experience of God in the afterlife. Clement VI, 1342–52, who protected the Jews against persecution by those who blamed them for the Black Death, established a reputation as a patron of the arts. Continued papal corruption and the papacy's absence from Rome gave rise to loud calls for sacramental and organizational reform. As the European world disintegrated into its component national parts, the universalism of the Church and the papacy was challenged. The Italian Renaissance, sometimes dated from the death of Petrarch in 1374, is generally seen as a break with medieval culture, but this was not entirely true, especially for the papacy, which witnessed the further development of many medieval themes. Notably, the continued decline of the political power of the Holy See was accelerated by the Great Schism, Western Schism, 1378–1417, in which rival factions of cardinals elected popes in both Rome and Avignon. The schism erupted as a result of the growing desire, voiced by Petrarch and by Saint Catherine of Siena, among others, to see the papacy return to Rome. Gregory Schi's, 1370–78, attempt at this led to further problems for the papacy and the outbreak of schism. His successor, Urban VI, 1378–89, acted in such a high-handed fashion that he alienated a considerable number of cardinals, who elected a new pope and returned to Avignon. Although Christians were divided in their loyalties, all of them recognized the dire nature of the situation. Theologians responded with the doctrine of conciliarism, which holds that an ecumenical council has greater authority than the pope and may depose him. Although the conciliar movement ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own success, it did help to resolve the crisis. In 1417 the Council of Constance ended the schism by deposing or accepting the resignations of three rival popes. Under Pope Nicholas V, 1447–55, there was a revival of classical studies, which contributed to the development of humanism and the Renaissance. Nicholas also envisioned the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica and the Papal Library. The vain and ostentatious Pope Paul II, 1464–71, who had a virtual mania for gems and collectibles, built the magnificent Palazzo Venezia in Rome. His successor, Pope Sixtus IV, 1471–84, proceeded with the beautification of the city. The secular outlook of the papacy reached a high point with the election of Rodrigo Borgia as Pope Alexander VI, 1492–1503, and continued under Pope Julius II, 1503–13, who proved a great patron of the arts. In many ways Julius, known as the Terrible, proved a better prince than a priest because of his love of war and political intrigue. He was followed by Pope Leo X, 1513–21, who supposedly quipped upon his accession, "God has given us the papacy, now let us enjoy it." During the 15th and 16th centuries, the popes created a great Christian capital and patronized artists such as Raphael, Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci. As Renaissance Rome became a center of art, science, and politics, its religious role declined, thus began the steps that provoked the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. Small wonder that these Renaissance popes, most of whom were more involved in political and financial alliances than in pastoral work, proved unable to respond effectively to the crisis. Only later did the papacy attempt to reform the Church by calling the Council of Trent, 1545–63, instituting the so-called Counter-Reformation, in which the Roman Catholic Church attempted to respond to the Protestant Reformation by purging itself of the abuses and ambiguities that had opened the way to revolt and then embarking upon recovery of the schismatic branches of Western Christianity. The theological and ecclesiastical decisions of this council largely determined the shape of the Roman Catholic Church until the second half of the 20th century. The popes of this period found their programs challenged by the growing power of the nation-states of Europe. Nevertheless, there were some positive developments, including reform of the College of Cardinals and the founding of new orders such as the Theatines, 1524, the Barnabites, 1530, the Capuchins, 1619, and, perhaps most important of all, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, 1540. These orders played a crucial role in the revitalization of the Church and in the growing influence of the papacy. They enabled the early modern popes, particularly Pius V, 1566–72, Sixtus V, 1585–90, Paul V, 1605–21, Innocent XI, 1676–89, and Benedict XIV, 1740–58, to proceed with their policy of evangelization. Further, the establishment of the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith in 1622 demonstrated the importance of the papacy in the missionary movement. The papacy also attempted to implement the policies of the Council of Trent but encountered political and diplomatic obstacles, as well as the reality that Christendom remained divided into competing states, whose religious aspirations were often subordinate to dynastic and national ambitions. Determined to continue the campaign against heresy, the popes of the Counter-Reformation did so inconsistently, displaying an ambiguous attitude toward modernization. Although they opposed the increasing infringement on papal prerogatives by national governments, they embraced the idea of structural modernization, which led to greater centralization in the Church around the papacy. The 18th century Enlightenment created a climate hostile to faith in general and to the papacy in particular. Philosophers and political leaders in France, Spain, Portugal, Naples, and elsewhere launched a two-pronged attack on the political and religious programs of the papacy, focusing much of their opposition on the Jesuits, which Pope Clement XIV, 1769–74, was compelled to suppress in 1773. To make matters worse, the centralization of the papacy was opposed by movements such as Gallicanism, in France, Febronianism, in Germany, and Josephism, in Austria and Italy, each of which championed national ecclesiastical autonomy from Rome. The revolutionary age in Europe, which opened with the French Revolution, continued the attack on the papacy. It provoked the capture of two popes by the French, Pius VI, 1775–99, and Pius VII, 1800–23, and the creation of a Roman Republic, 1798–99, which replaced the Papal States. Although the conservative powers re-established the Papal States at the Congress of Vienna, 1814–15, the papacy now confronted Italian nationalism and the Risorgimento, Italian, rising again, the 19th-century movement of Italian unification, which prompted a counter-risorgimento on the part of the papacy. Pope Pius IX, 1846–78, the longest reigning pope, began his career as a reformer but became increasingly conservative in his outlook. His Syllabus of Errors, 1864, listed 80 of the principal errors of our time, and set the Church on a conservative course centered on the papacy. The alignment of the papacy with conservative political forces worked to undermine liberal and modernizing influences within the Church and contributed to the loss of the Papal States to the new Kingdom of Italy in 1870. Divested of its remaining temporal power, the papacy increasingly relied on its spiritual or teaching authority, proclaiming papal infallibility and espousing ultramontanism, the idea that the pope is the absolute ruler of the Church. Thus, in 1870 the First Vatican Council officially defined as a matter of faith the absolute primacy of the Pope and his infallibility when pronouncing on matters of faith and morals. Subsequently, Pope Leo XIII, 1878–1903, condemned Americanism, a movement among American Catholics that sought to adapt the Church to modern civilization, and Pope Pius X, 1903–14, condemned modernism, a movement that employed modern historical and critical methods to interpret Scripture and Catholic teaching and that also challenged papal centralization. The 1929 Lateran Treaty with the fascist government of Italy created the minuscule state of Vatican City and granted the papacy formal temporal sovereignty over the territory. Despite the social program initiated by Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, of New Things, in 1891, suspicion of liberal ideas and modern culture persisted in Rome until the Second Vatican Council, also called Vatican II, called in 1962 by Pope John XXI, 1958–63, and continued until 1965 by Paul VI, 1963–78. John sought an aggiornamento, Italian, bringing up to date, to modernize the Church, and in part he succeeded. Although many conservative Catholics believed that the Council went too far, especially in terminating the requirement of the traditional Latin Mass in favor of Masses celebrated in local, vernacular languages, the theological and organizational changes made at Vatican II significantly revitalized the Church and opened it to reform, ecumenical dialogue, and increased participation of bishops, clergy, and laity. Internationally, the papacy assumed a more dynamic role following the unsuccessful attempts at mediation by Pope Benedict XV, 1914–22, and Pope Pius XII, 1939–58, during World War I and World War II. At the close of the 20th century the prospect of Pius XII's canonization renewed the controversy over his neutrality during World War II and his failure to denounce the Holocaust more forcefully and openly, a fact that his critics dubbed the silence. Paul VI assumed a more interventionist policy, speaking out on a number of issues and traveling worldwide. He also promulgated the landmark document Nostra Aetate, In Our Age, in 1965, which rejected the traditional accusation that the Jews killed Christ, recognized the legitimacy of Judaism and Islam, and condemned antisemitism. The internationalization of the College of Cardinals under John XI increased its numbers beyond the 70 set by Sixtus V in 1586. In response, Paul VI imposed new regulations specifying that cardinals who are age 80 or older cannot vote for a pope and limiting the number of voting cardinals to 120. Although John Paul II, 1978–2005, created more cardinals than any of his predecessors, he confirmed the number of voting cardinals at 120 in his decree Universi Dominici Gregis, Shepherd of the Lord's Whole Flock, 1995. In 1996 John Paul issued a set of rules governing papal elections, one of which provided that under certain circumstances the traditionally required majority of 2/3 plus 1 could be replaced by a simple majority. This rule was repealed by his successor, Benedict XVI, 2005–13, in 2007. The pontificate of John Paul II, one of the longest in history, left a profound mark on the Church and the papacy. A charismatic and beloved figure, John Paul traveled more than all other popes combined, played a crucial role in the collapse of communism in Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe, canonized numerous new saints, and made great strides toward interfaith dialogue with non-Christians. He established formal and full diplomatic relations with Israel and sought greater reconciliation with the Jews and Judaism. He was the first pope to worship in a synagogue, and he made a historic pilgrimage to Jerusalem, during which he prayed at the Western Wall. However, he retained traditional positions on a number of issues, including the ordination of women, clerical marriage, homosexuality, birth control, and abortion, and he was implacably opposed to liberation theology, a movement that arose in Latin America and stressed the preferential option for the poor. John Paul II felt its principles were uncomfortably close to Marxism. John Paul's efforts to bridge the gap with other Christian churches met with only limited success. His stance against the use of condoms to prevent sexually transmitted diseases was criticized by human rights workers and some politicians for its perceived contribution to the spread of AIDS in Africa. The global scandal of the 1990s and early 2000s surrounding the Church's handling of numerous cases of sexual abuse by priests prompted some critics of the Pope to further question the wisdom of his stance on sexual issues. This controversy became part of a long-standing debate, joined by Catholics and non-Catholics alike, about whether the Church had accommodated too much or too little to the secular, modern age. The 2005 election of conservative German theologian and Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger as Pope Benedict XVI did not immediately resolve this debate. Benedict continued his predecessor's commitment to ecumenical and interfaith outreach. Yet, while Vatican II proclaimed that the Church should engage with and interpret its mission in response to contemporary cultural mores, Benedict's homilies, public addresses, and encyclicals, the latter including Deus Caritas Est, 2006, God is Love, and Spe Salvi, 2007, Saved by Hope, offered instead a sharp critique of the foundations of the modern age and warned against the dangers of secularism. In 2013 he became the first pope to resign since Gregory XII in 1415, citing health reasons. Francis, 2013-25, the first South American and the first Jesuit to become pope, was elected after Benedict resigned. Francis offered hope to clergy and laity alike that the Church would confront the scandals and controversies of the previous decades. However, conservatives objected to Francis's willingness to depart from tradition in certain settings, e.g., by washing the feet of two young women, including one Muslim, in a Maundy Thursday ritual that had traditionally excluded women. Francis issued a decree in 2016 that revised the Roman Missal concerning Holy Week observances to allow the inclusion of women and girls in the foot-washing ritual. Other reforms Francis made to the Church included limiting the celebration of the traditional Latin Mass, for which Benedict XVI had made some concessions to traditionalist Catholics, restructuring the Roman Curia and the Vatican's finances to allow for more transparency, and preaching tolerance of homosexuals. In particular, his second encyclical, Laudato Si, Praise Be to You, 2015, addressing climate change and integral ecology, had a profound impact on the global Church. The clergy abuse crisis remained an issue of concern during Francis's papacy, and he delivered apologies on behalf of the Church to survivors in countries such as Ireland and Canada. Francis also advocated for the rights of migrants throughout his papacy. On May 8, 2025, Robert Francis Prevost was elected the first American pope, succeeding Francis. He took the name Leo XIV, and his first words as pope were, "Peace be with all of you." Pope Joan, legendary female pontiff who supposedly reigned, under the title of John VIII, for slightly more than 25 months, from 855 to 858, between the pontificates of Saint Leo IV, 847 to 855, and Benedict III, 855 to 858. It has subsequently been proved that a gap of only a few weeks fell between Leo and Benedict and that the story is entirely apocryphal. One of the earliest extant sources for the Pope Joan legend is De Septem Donis Spiritus Sancti, on the 7 Gifts of the Holy Spirit, by the 13th century French Dominican Stephen of Bourbon, who dated Joan's election c. 1100. In this account the nameless pontiff was a clever scribe who became a papal notary and later was elected pope. Pregnant at the time of her election, she gave birth during the procession to the Lateran, whereupon she was dragged out of Rome and stoned to death. The story was widely spread during the later 13th century, mostly by friars and primarily by means of interpolations made in many manuscripts of the Chronicon Pontificum et Imperatorum, Chronicle of the Popes and Emperors, by the 13th century Polish Dominican Martin of Tropol. Support for the version that she died in childbirth and was buried on the spot was derived from the fact that in later years papal processions used to avoid a particular street, allegedly where the disgraceful event had occurred. The name Joan was not finally adopted until the 14th century. Other names commonly given were Agnes or Gilberta. According to later legend, particularly by Martin, who dated her election in 855 and who specifically named her Johannes Angelicus, Joan was an Englishwoman, but her birthplace was given as the German city of Mainz, an apparent inconsistency that some writers reconciled by explaining that her parents had migrated to that city. She supposedly fell in love with an English Benedictine monk and, dressing as a man, accompanied him to Athens. Having acquired great learning, she moved to Rome, where she became cardinal and pope. From the 13th century the story appears in literature, including the works of the Benedictine chronicler Ranulph Higden and the Italian humanists Giovanni Boccaccio and Petrarch. In the 15th century, Joan's existence was regarded as fact, even by the Council of Constance in 1415. During the 16th and 17th centuries the story was used for Protestant polemics. Such scholars as Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, afterward Pope Pius II, and Cardinal Caesar Baronius regarded the story as unfounded, but it was the Calvinist David Blondel who made the first determined attempt to destroy the myth, in his Éclaircissement familier de la question, si un femme a été assise au siège papal de Rome, 1647, familiar enlightenment of the question, whether a woman has been seated on the papal throne in Rome. According to one theory, the fable grew from widespread gossip concerning the influence wielded by the 10th-century Roman woman Senator Marozia and her mother Theodora of the powerful house of Theophylact. Western Schism, in the history of the Roman Catholic Church, the period from 1378 to 1417, when there were two, and later three, rival popes, each with his own following, his own sacred college of cardinals, and his own administrative offices. Shortly after the return of the papal residents to Rome following almost 70 years of the Avignon papacy, the Archbishop of Bari was elected pope as Urban VI amid demands by the Roman populace for a Roman or at least an Italian. Urban VI proved to be so hostile to the cardinals, who had assumed great powers during the years at Avignon, that a group of cardinals retired to Anagni and elected one of themselves, Robert of Geneva, as Clement VII, claiming the election of Urban VI had been invalid because it was made under fear. Clement VII then took up residence at Avignon. Although Roman Catholic Church historians generally agree that Urban VI and his successors were the legitimate popes, there has never been an official pronouncement to this effect. The double election had disastrous effects upon the Church. The followers of the two popes were divided chiefly along national lines, and thus the dual papacy fostered the political antagonisms of the time. The spectacle of rival popes denouncing each other produced great confusion and resulted in a tremendous loss of prestige for the papacy. Various proposals for ending the schism were made, especially by the University of Paris, which suggested either mutual resignation or a decision by an independent tribunal or a general council. This last proposal was in line with the growing conciliar movement, according to which a general council has greater authority than a pope. Both lines of popes refused to submit. Eventually cardinals from both obediences, seeking to end the schism, arranged the Council of Pisa, which met in 1409 and elected a third pope, Alexander V, who was succeeded shortly thereafter by Baldassare Casa, who took the name John XXAI. Under pressure from the Emperor Sigismund, John convoked, in 1414, the Council of Constance, which deposed him, received the resignation of the Roman Pope, Gregory XII, and dismissed the claims of the Avignon Pope, Benedict XIII. That series of events opened the way to the election of Martin V in November 1417, whereby the schism was ended. The picturesque city of Anagni, Italy, a one-time papal summer residence not too distant from the renowned Monte Cassino Abbey, is roughly an hour's drive from Rome. Once the seat of pagan temples and sanctuaries in the days of the Roman Empire, by the 5th century it had become an important diocese of the Christian world. In the 9th century the city's first cathedral was built on the ruins of the temple dedicated to the goddess Sarira. During the 10th and the 11th centuries Anagni developed strong ties with the papal court. The popes of that era began to consider the old capital city of the Ernestine region a safer and healthier spot to live, as compared to Rome, which was struck by frequent epidemic diseases. Anagni continued to be among the favorite residences of pontiffs over the next few centuries. Because of its illustrious residents, the city was the site of many significant historical events, particularly those involving the struggle between papacy and empire. In 1122, Pope Callistus II promulgated the bull of the Concordat of Worms from Anagni. In 1176, after the Battle of Legnano, Pope Alexander III received the imperial legates with whom he elaborated the Pactum Anagninum, Anagni's agreement, the basis for the peace that was achieved in Venice in 1177. The 13th century brought a golden age for the city. In the course of 1 century, Anagni gave 4 popes to the church. The first to ascend to the papal throne was Lotarius Conti, who as Innocent III, 1198–1216, was one of the outstanding personalities of his century, together with Frederick II, whose coronation as Emperor of Germany he favored, and Saint Francis of Assisi. It was Pope Innocent III who approved the first rule of the Franciscan order. Pope Innocent III is also noteworthy for having codified the Church's doctrine on the relation between the spiritual and temporal spheres. He explained, at a time when such issues were hotly contested, that the Church has potestas directa, direct power, regarding religious issues, but only potestas indirecta, indirect power, over earthly matters. Pope Innocent III died in 1216, leaving the Church at the historical peak of her power. His efforts were taken up by Pope Gregory IX, Ugolino Conti, 1227–1241, who belonged to the powerful family of Conti di Anagni. This new pontiff, too, was quickly caught up in the struggle between spiritual and temporal leaders. On September 29, 1227, in Anagni's cathedral, he excommunicated Emperor Frederick II, who had abandoned the crusade that the emperor himself had proclaimed. The evocative ceremony took place by the lights of the torches, first shaken, then thrown on the ground, and finally blown out by the prelates. In September 1230, after the reconciliation, Pope Gregory IX received Frederick of Swabia in Anagni. During his pontificate, Pope Alexander IV, 1254–1261, Gregory's relative and Anagni's third pope, had to face the raging theological dispute raised by the hostility of the University of Paris toward the mendicant orders. The leader of this dispute, the author of a vitriolic pamphlet attacking the Dominicans, was Guillaume de Saint-Amour, whose text was burned in front of the cathedral, the sentence having been passed in Anagni in September 1256. But the name of Anagni is especially known because of events that took place during the pontificate of Boniface VIII, the fourth bishop of Rome, who was a native of the city, a member of the powerful Caetani family. His election, which occurred after the abdication of Celestine V, had been opposed by French cardinals and by the powerful Colonna family. And so it was that at Anagni, on the night of September 7 to 8, 1303, Pope Boniface VIII was captured and outraged with a slap onto his face by Sciarra Colonna. Colonna had come to Anagni along with William of Nogaret, an advisor to the King of France, and a gang of armed men. Their plan was to abduct the Pope, then arrange for him to be deposed by a council. But when the local populace learned about that notorious slap of Anagni, they rose up against the would-be kidnappers, foiling their plans, and freed the captive Pope. The quest for power. But why had Philip IV of France, Philip the Fair, sought to capture the Pope? During 2003, the city of Anagni is hosting a series of events to commemorate the pontificate of Boniface VIII, leading up to an October 11 ceremony marking the 700th anniversary of his death. The city's mayor, Franco Fiorito, observes that Boniface was a major figure in church history for several reasons. He proclaimed the first Jubilee year in 1300, and established in Rome the University, La Sapienza, which was to become the largest in Europe. But, the Anagni slap remains the single most memorable episode of his papacy, and that event in particular was remembered at a conference of historians, held in Anagni on the 700th anniversary of the event in September. Giovanni Diurni, historian at Rome's Tor Vergata University, pointed out that the episode must be seen against the background of a rising confrontation between the papacy and the French throne, which was probably the most powerful European kingdom of that time. The clash involved the division of power between the spiritual and temporal domains, with the former being embodied by the Church and the second by the French state, which at that time took the form of a Christian empire. In his papal bulls, Pope Boniface III followed in the footsteps of his predecessor Innocent III, maintaining the distinction between the two powers, each with its own clear-cut sphere of competence. King Philip IV, however, sought a different sort of division of powers, in which the king would have uncontested authority over his Christian empire and its subjects, including the Pope, who would be a salaried employee of the throne. Although Pope Boniface and King Philip had been allies earlier in their respective reigns, by the beginning of the 14th century the contrast between their views had become so harsh that the Pope withdrew the privilege of French kings to levy taxes on the French clergy, and denounced Philip in the famous Bull Unam Sanctum. But King Philip pressed his own case. He summoned the nobles into assembly and read a forged papal bull, which in provocative tones stated that the king must be totally dependent on the Pope. Boniface forcefully denied any connection with that document, but it did serve the king's cause, rallying support for Philip's claims against the papacy. As he mounted a campaign to oust the Pope, King Philip formed an alliance with the Colonna family. Two cardinals from that family said that Boniface III was an illegitimate pope, arguing that the abdication of his predecessor, Celestine V, the only pontiff ever to voluntarily resign, was invalid. Unnerved by what could be considered the first smear campaign in the history of public relations, Pope Boniface died shortly after the Anagni outrage. The subsequent transfer of the papal court to Avignon began a long period of decline for the city. History's Lessons. Another speaker at the September Conference of Historians in Anagni, Roberto de Mattei, observed that Boniface VIII is among the most vilified popes in history. Yet today, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see him as a defender of the traditional Catholic teaching on church-state relations, teachings that have been frequently confirmed by his successors up to Pope John Paul II. As Pope Boniface and his successors have taught, a total separation between spiritual and temporal authority can easily produce relativism, triggering an unbridled quest for secular power that has produced some of the worst dictatorial regimes in history, as the 20th century bears witness. On the other hand, the lack of any distinction between the spiritual and temporal realms can lead to a complete absorption of civil society into religion, a phenomenon now painfully visible in the world of Islam. De Mattei spoke also of the symbolic dimension of the Anagni slap. 5 centuries earlier, the spiritual and temporal leaders of Christian Europe had shown themselves in complete accord, with the crowning of Charlemagne by the Pope as first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire on Christmas Eve in 800 AD. 5 centuries later, the personal assault on a Roman pontiff showed that the accord was broken, and an era was ended. These were two symbolic and opposing events, de Mattei said. In much the same way as the crowning of Charlemagne ushered in medieval Christianity, the slap of Anagni marked its end. Among the contemporaries of Pope Boniface, there were a perceptive few who realized the implications of the famous slap, recognizing that the offense was aimed not at the Pope as a person, but against his office. Among them was Dante Alighieri, the most famous Italian poet of all times. Although he was harshly critical of Boniface III, and consigned him to damnation in his Inferno, Dante was also outraged by the imprisonment of the Pope. He portrayed it, in his Purgatorio, XX, 86, 90, as a slap at Christ himself. The ever-pressing financial undertakings of the papacy kept Leo X in constant need of new means of raising revenue. The wars with France, his lavish support of the arts, the construction of St. Peter's, and a projected crusade against the Turks all contributed to the financial needs of the papacy. One important source of revenue had long been the dispensing of indulgences, remission of the temporal penalty for sins, for money. During the reign of Julius II, indulgences had been authorized for financial contributions for the construction of St. Peter's. Leo, who was very much interested in continuing this work, reaffirmed the indulgence shortly after his ascent. Nevertheless, because of its unpopularity in Northern Europe, based primarily on economic reasons, it was not until early in 1517 that Johann Tetzel, a Dominican friar, actually began to preach the indulgence in the archdioceses of Mainz and Magdeburg in Germany. In response to this preaching, Martin Luther circulated his 95 Theses. By the following year, 1518, Luther's ideas had reached Rome, and Leo ordered the head of the Augustinian order, of which Luther was a member, to silence him. When this failed, the Pope tried to work through Frederick of Saxony, but again to no avail. On June 15, 1520, Leo issued Ex Surge Domini, a papal bull that charged Luther with 41 instances of deviation from the teaching and practice of the Roman Catholic Church and ordered him to recant within 60 days or suffer excommunication. Luther, who by this time had gained the support of influential figures in Germany, defied the Pope. Thus, Leo was left no alternative but to issue a papal bull, Decet Romanum Pontificem, of excommunication on January 3, 1521. Leo X had not viewed the Lutheran movement with the seriousness that history later indicated was warranted. He could recall that the Church, after all, had withstood the teachings of an English reformer, John Wycliffe, and a Bohemian reformer, Jan Hus. Leo believed Luther was another heretic whose teachings would lead some of the faithful astray, but, as had happened in the past, the true religion would triumph in time. In December 1521 Leo X died suddenly, leaving behind him political turmoil in Italy and religious turmoil spreading across northern Europe. Money. People worry about it, think of ways to get more of it, and dream about how to spend it. But how much do we really know about money? Some of the earliest currencies were objects from nature. A notable example is cowrie shells, first used as money about 1200 BCE. Although they may seem a pretty random choice, the shells had a number of advantages. They were similar in size, small, and durable. While the mollusks that produce the shells are found in the coastal waters of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, the expansion of trade meant that even some European countries accepted cowrie shells as currency. Shells in the form of wampum, tubular shell beads, were used as money by Native Americans. Another currency from nature was whale teeth, which were used by Fijians. And the people of Yap Island, now part of Micronesia, carved huge discs of limestone that eventually became currency and remained part of the island's culture. Counterfeiting dates to the invention of money. Even wampum was the target of counterfeiters. Forgery proved such a huge problem around the world that harsh penalties were enacted. Chinese currency from about the 14th century carried the warning that counterfeiters would be decapitated, and England was known for punishing perpetrators by burning them at the stake. In the American colonies too, death greeted early counterfeiters. Numerous measures were taken to prevent forgeries. Ben Franklin, who owned a firm that printed money for several colonies, notably misspelled Pennsylvania, believing that counterfeiters would correct the error in their forgeries. Today anti-counterfeiting measures are much more elaborate. For example, the $20 bill, the most counterfeited note in the United States, has raised printing and a watermark and security thread that are visible when the note is held to the light. However, penalties for counterfeiting have relaxed. In the United States, the maximum prison sentence is 20 years. While the use of metal for money can be traced back to Babylon before 2000 BCE, standardized and certified coinage may not have existed until the 7th century BCE. According to many historians, it was during this time that the Kingdom of Lydia, in present-day Turkey, issued the first regulated coins. They appeared during the reign, c. 610 c. 560 BCE, of King Aliats and were made of electrum, a natural mixture of gold and silver. Crudely shaped like beans, these coins featured the royal symbol, a lion. Aliat's son, Croesus, reigned c. 560 to 546, reformed the kingdom's currency, introducing silver coins and gold coins. Soon such currency began appearing elsewhere. About the 6th century BCE leather and animal hide began to be fashioned into currency. Early ancient Rome reportedly used this type of money. It was also found in such areas as Carthage and what is now France, and Russia is believed to have used leather money into Peter the Great's reign, 1682 to 1725 CE. The Chinese Emperor Wudi, reigned 141 to 87 BCE, created currency out of skins from his personal collection of white stags. It was fringed and decorated with elaborate designs. Although no longer used, leather money may have left a lasting legacy. Some believe it gave rise to the use of buck as slang for dollar. Given that paper is widely believed to have originated in China, it is fitting that that country introduced paper currency. This innovation is widely thought to have occurred during the reign, 997 to 1022 CE, of Emperor Shenzong. It was made from the bark of mulberry trees, so, in a sense, money really did grow on trees. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, paper money had spread to other parts of the world. The bulk of this currency, however, was not money in the traditional sense. Instead, it served as promissory notes, promises to pay specified amounts of gold or silver, which were key in the development of banks. Bitcoin is a digital currency system created in 2009 by an anonymous computer programmer or group of programmers known as Satoshi Nakamoto. The currency is not issued by a central bank and is not regulated, though a decentralized network of computers keeps track of transactions. Users of Bitcoins are anonymous, known only by their digital wallet ID. The value of Bitcoins is determined by bidding, similar to the way stocks are valued. How are Bitcoins created? In a process called mining. This involves a race between computers to solve complex math problems and thus verify blocks of transactions. While that may sound easy, it isn't. It's estimated that nearly 7 trillion attempts may have to be made before a solution is discovered. In the end, the owner of the winning computer gets newly created Bitcoins, and the system is made more secure. The cap for the number of Bitcoins that can be created is 21 million, and more than 17 million have been created so far.